sympatric speciation. We've kind of gone over this already, but I just want to make sure you understand the distinction. So allopatric speciation, that means in different places. So I'll kind of show you. Oops. And here we got one place and another. That's allopatric speciation. Okay? So normally, sometimes there's some kind of geological barrier that interrupts these things. Okay. Now, sympatric speciation means in the same place. Sympatric is in the same place. And let's think about this. So like these apples and hawthorns, each tree is kind of like a separate habitat. So in a sense, sympatric in this case is almost identical to allopatric. It's just at a very, very smaller scale. So, in other words, here's the location. And then interspersed are apple trees and hawthorn trees. And in the life cycle of these flies, the apple flies only lay their eggs and have sex and do everything else on apples. They never go to the hawthorn. And then the hawthorn flies are the same way. So in a sense, they're using the habitat completely differently, even though they're all in the same place. Okay. And then with these Lake Victoria fish that have generated like 500 species of new species in a short period of time, well, when these lakes were formed, if you know anything about lakes, there's all different kinds of habitats in them. There's right along the shore, right? So let's take a look at this. So here's a big lake. So there's habitat right along the shore in very shallow water. There's habitat right out in the middle. Okay. There's habitat, let's say, along the bottom of the lake, very deep, so there's differences in depth. And then these animals actually feed perhaps and mate and meet in different places. So it's the same sort of thing. It's all happening in the same lake, but the habitat or the overall lake has been divided up into many different small habitats that each favor a specific phenotype. Okay? So that's that. Okay. So we've been talking, of course, about the basic idea for speciation is reproductive isolation. Okay? And we've talked about how that happens in terms of, first, geographically. Okay? And vicariance and things like that, where you have a habitat's divided, if you remember that little video, the Wibblies, and you have the Easties and the Westies and all that. Okay. But there are different mechanisms that are going on here. So these are called reproductive barriers. They are generally broken up into two major groups. One is prezygotic, and the other is postzygotic. Prezygotic, well, a zygote is a fertilized egg. right? So that means before an egg is fertilized. And then postzygotic is after fertilization, okay, and involves different mechanisms. And then furthermore, there is prezygotic, precopulatory, that means before having sex, reproductive isolation. So I'll write this. Okay. And then there's also post-copulatory. Okay. And that goes right here. Okay, so there's a number of things. Okay. Oh, and prezygotic, and if it, okay, ecological, two species that breed in different portions of the habitat or at different times in different portions of the habitat. So it can include spatial, or temporal, different times. And these are all ecological kinds of isolation. So two species breed in different portions of their habitat, different places where they don't meet, or in different seasons or different time periods, times of the day. And because they don't meet, mating is prevented. They never really get a chance, whatever. Okay. Now, behavioral isolation is also prezygotic. It's also part of mating ecology, so it's actually part of ecological isolation, but in this case, I'm going to say it's because behaviorally the two species do not recognize each other as the same species, as having a possibility of having the other as a partner. Okay, so one species might, the female might prefer their own species, and the male has a blue head, and the other species has a red head, and each female prefers the species there's a part of. So if the red-headed female, the female isn't red-headed, the male is, but if the red-headed female species sees a blue head, she's not going to want to mate with him. Okay. Okay, so that's behavioral isolation. And then there's mechanical isolation, where the genitals don't fit. Or, if you remember, between the Great Dane and a Chihuahua, it would make mating difficult, wouldn't it? Okay. Even though they're the same species. And then finally, prezygotic, that means before a zygote is made, but post-copulatory, after sex. So they have sex, but their gametes don't actually work together. The sperm of one is not able to actually fertilize the egg of the other. Okay, so this is gametic isolation, and mechanical isolation, all these are mating prevented, and then fertilization prevented. Now, and then finally, okay, postzygotic. So, a zygote, there's fertilization, but the zygote dies, or the embryo dies at some point. Okay, so zygotes fail to develop properly and they die before birth. So it's not a zygote, it becomes an embryo. You can have a zygote that just never goes any further than the single cell fertilized egg, right? But you can have further down the line, so miscarriages, right? Okay, so no offspring are produced. Hybrid sterility. Hybrids survive, but they can't produce offspring because they're sterile. Or it might be that one sex of the hybrids is sterile and the other one is not, which kind of sometimes happens with horses and donkeys, depending on who the mother is, whether it's a donkey or the horse. And then as far as the offspring, if it's a female offspring, sometimes they're actually sterile, but the males are not. Okay, so hybrid sterility. Say zygote death, hybrid sterility, and then finally hybrids survive. They can even reproduce, but they don't do very well. Okay, in other words, compared to non-hybrids, in other words, matings between the same species, they just don't do as well. They are lacking in surviving and reproducing. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So these are reproductive, pre-mating reproductive barriers. Two real quick ones. Spatial ecological isolation, in other words, Mexican spotted owl, northern spotted owl. They're actually very closely related genetically, but they occur in different places, and they're actually adapted. So the northern spotted owl is found in dense coniferous forests of redwood and spruce, western hemlock, all these kinds of certain pine species, whereas the Mexican spotted owl is found in the southwest. Often where they mate, there's no trees around. They mate on cliff sides and things like that. Okay. Or ecological isolation. Temporal isolation, that's time. Temporal means time differences. Okay, and here's these corals. Well, obviously corals, there's all these different species of coral, and they release their gametes into the water column. The males release sperm, the females release eggs, and then the eggs are fertilized in the water column. Well, if all the different coral species released all their sperm and eggs at the same time, it would be a mess. So what has happened is there have been ecological changes so that certain species release their sperm and eggs, let's say early in the morning, between these certain dates. And then there's another species that releases their sperm and eggs the same days, but only in the afternoon. or in the evening. Okay, so different time periods, so they aren't making hybrids. Okay. And then pollination. Of course, pollination is done by insects. So these are different species of mimulus. Actually, they're not mimulus anymore, but they've changed. But anyway, mimulus, one was cardinalis, and I don't know which one this was. But they are actually, they are pollinated by different animals. The one on the top is pollinated, I think, by a beetle, and the one on the bottom is exclusively pollinated by hummingbirds. Okay? So the hummingbirds, they're not going to go to the other flower type. And so they're isolated in how they're pollinated. There's also gametic isolation, or mechanical isolation, actually. These are two different snail species, and they actually have different copulatory organs. So male and female organisms are not compatible. So that's mechanical isolation. And we'll get to gametic in a second. And then behavioral isolation between blue-footed boobies. They, in fact, have a very specific courting dance. And if the mating dance is not precise enough, they won't mate. So there's another closer related species called the brown-footed booby. They have their own courting dance. A lot of times these two species actually breed on the same island, but they don't mix. The females and the males both do not recognize, first of all, they have to have blue feet, or the brown-footed boobies have to have brown feet, or they won't recognize them. And then the dances are very specific. So we'll actually take a look at that. So, here we go. Okay. So I'm not going to run this now, but I want you to watch it. You can also get it on Canvas under Chapter 13, under Media, Slides and Media. It'll say Blue-Footed Boobies, and you can watch that. Thank you. Okay, so again, ecological isolation. Different corals. These are different coral species. One species, shallow water sea fan, deep water sea fan. They're actually different species, but they're closer related, and they actually live at different depths. And obviously, the ecology. So one has adaptations for living in shallow water. So there's probably more oxygen, more sunlight, and also less pressure. And then deeper, much more pressure. So some very big differences. And so even if you had some coral, let's say larvae that, let's say, from the shallow went to the deep, they probably wouldn't be able to reproduce. Okay. So, in fact, what they're doing is they're transplanting. The scientists, they did a transplant experiment. They took deep coral and planted some up in the shallow and shallow in the deep and see what would happen. Okay. And then the boobies again. Now, let's take a look at this. Okay. So here we are with vicariant speciation. We have an original population. Right? Some barrier erupts between the two populations. Let's say geographic isolation. We've now got two populations that are separated. They go their separate ecological ways and their separate evolutionary ways, different mutations in different populations. There might be differences in terms of environment now and ecology. All kinds of things might have changed. And then over time, let's say the barrier is removed. So even though the barrier is removed, isolation has been maintained. It's called reinforcement. Okay? And this is usually reproductive reinforcement so they've been apart, these two populations, they've evolved differences. Even when they bring them back together, they're still not likely to mate because of these different isolating mechanisms we talked about. They mature at different times. They mate at different times. They mate in different places, all that kind of stuff. So, what's likely to happen when they do come back together? Okay. Incipient species. Secondary contact. They come back together. You can see the differences in color. And what happens? When they get back together, they start mating like nothing's happened, even though it's been years since they've come in contact with each other. They start mating and they start producing viable offspring. Gene flow happens again. The two species then fuse together as one species. Okay, that's one outcome. The same thing, secondary contact. And now there's selection against hybrids. In other words, there are reproductive isolating mechanisms that maintain selection against the hybrids. It's either prezygotic or postzygotic. Okay? In other words, there's now this barrier. Okay? And speciation is complete, even though they've come together and they're now in the same, there's gene flow possible, but it's still not happening. And these are intrinsic barriers, prezygotic or postzygotic. Okay. Now, another thing that can happen is you have this extrinsic barrier, and if it's removed in the contact, there's actually a hybrid zone. Okay? But in this case, hybrid zone contact, there's still gene flow going on between them. But in this lower one, there's actually this formation of a hybrid zone right in between. We'll make it this one. And these are hybrids. In this case, it's right here. And these are actually hybrids. And in some cases, you can even create a third species instead of a second one. Okay. So, what does prezygotic mean? It means before a zygote is produced. It can happen before they even start to copulate because they don't recognize each other as the same, or they have sex in different places, or all that kind of stuff. how is the Boobia's ritual dance or prezygotic barrier? Well, if the right dance isn't happening, and let's say the brown-footed booby is there, and brown-footed boobies have brown feet, then they're not going to mate. They won't recognize it. It's like, say, one is saying to the other, what kind of screwy dance is that? Forget it. You're creepy. Okay. So, gametic isolation. So, we've got these sea urchin species. So, sperm from neither Echinomus viridis or these are two different species is able to fertilize the egg from a third species, E. lucuntur. Egg and sperm size in relation to the other is not to scale. So, E. verbrundi is found on the Pacific coast. Both E. lacunta and viridis are found on the Atlantic side. Okay. So let's see here. So long ago, the Panama landmass was not continuous and did not separate the two oceans. The species likely evolved through both allopatric and sympatric speciation. So, in other words, there's reproductive isolation. They can still release sperm and eggs at the same time. I'm not sure how they actually. Let's see. So, which species are sympatric? With lacuntur, it is E. viridis because it's found on the same side of the Panama landmass. Which species are allopatric? It's the other one. Van Bruti. If two individuals have incompatible gametes, what will be the result of a mating event? They will not form a zygote. Okay? So, even though the gametes might come in contact with the zygote, the egg of lacuntur, it will not be able to fertilize the egg. Okay, probably there are proteins on the outside of the sperm and the egg that require them to be symmetric or the right proteins, and then otherwise it won't happen. Okay, now, post-zygotic isolation. So, hybrid inviability or lethal hybrid. Either the zygote there's a zygote, but it dies right away or soon, or something else happens. So, sheep and goats are close together, but they actually have different chromosomes. Sheep have 27 pairs, that's 54 total chromosomes, and goats have 30 or 60 total. So, if you actually let these two animals together, a male and a female, they will mate. They will try to mate, but embryos die soon after fertilization. I'm not sure for how long, but it always produces a lethal embryo and dies during development. Okay, and then hybrid infertility. We've got a donkey and a mule. A donkey and a horse. Donkeys have 62 chromosomes, that's 31, and horses 32 and 64 chromosomes, right? And so during meiosis, they actually produce a zygote. The zygote goes through development, and you end up with a mule with 63 chromosomes. Unfortunately, because there's different chromosome numbers, they're not exactly able to pair during the first part of meiosis, and so you end up with an animal that is sterile. In other words, they cannot reproduce. Okay. And then there's another way that you can actually have speciation. I probably told you about this at one point, but it's called polyploidy. Polyploidy is when the number of chromosomes in a cell becomes doubled. This can happen by a mutation that simply makes two copies of each chromosome. It can happen when the chromosomes from two different species are mixed to form a form of sympatric speciation. Many plants are both male and female, so they can simply fertilize each other. So, an example is the Gilead plant from Mojave Desert. The species, Gilead transformata, turned out to be a hybrid of Gilead minor and Gilead cloquii. It has as many chromosomes as the 35. In other words, but so let's say Gilead minor had 6 chromosomes, and the thing is, when you get polyploid species, they oftentimes cannot, because of different chromosome number, cross back and breed with their parents. So, in other words, Gilead transmontana cannot breed now, even though one parent was cloquii and the other was minor, because each of those species have, one has 6 and the other has 7, and Montana now has 13, so they don't line up. That's called polyploid speciation, and it can actually happen instantaneously. Okay? And there's 2 different ways. I'm not going to ask you this, but there's autopolyploids where they're derived from a single taxon, let's say. Okay, and been found in the ground finches, on Daphne major again, and it turns out there's this new hybrid that was discovered 20 years ago that is now looks like a separate species. It's much bigger than the 2 ancestral species. So here's the hybrid, big bird hybrid, and it's actually much bigger than Espanola tetrafish, and the other one was Polio, the medium thing. Okay? And it turns out that the big bird, they don't even try to breed with the other ones. They have different ecology, they eat different foods, they hang out together, obviously, and it looks like it's the actual creation. Even though there was gene flow, this created a hybrid with completely new characteristics. Okay. Okay, now let's talk about coevolution. This is something that I worked on for my PhD. Okay, so I told you about, in the beginning, about when we started evolution, about predator-prey, cheetah and gazelles. So the cheetah chases the gazelle, right? And the gazelle runs away from the cheetah. Only the fastest gazelles get away. In other words, if you end up with a gazelle, remember there's variation. Some gazelles are faster than others. Obviously, there's also differences in terms of age. It might be easier to get a young gazelle or a very old gazelle compared to one that's in the prime of this life. Okay? But there's still going to be differences among gazelles in terms of who's faster than others. Just like there is with people. Obviously, compare me to Michael Jordan. I mean, there's no comparison. I'm incredible. I realize that. But Michael can do something that I can't do. And for some reason, women think it's great, whereas I can do other things that he's not even aware of. It doesn't matter. Anyway, I can't dunk. Okay. The same thing, there are gazelles that are running faster. And the fastest running gazelles are going to get away from the cheetah. Okay? In fact, as long as the second slowest gazelle is faster than the slowest gazelle, the cheetah is going to get the slowest gazelle, right? You only have to run as fast as the next slowest, as the slowest person. Okay, so that's evolution. Over time, only those gazelles that are very fast and speed is heritable, okay, because of what their legs are and the muscles and all that kind of stuff, they survive, and they're the ones that reproduce, and they produce offspring that are fast. The same thing is going on. Okay, so the cheetahs, what they're doing, they're the selective force. They remove the slow gazelles from the population, only leave the fast gazelles that can escape. Well, the same thing is going on between the gazelles having the same effect on the cheetahs, right? So the gazelles are also selecting. When they run away from cheetahs, there are some cheetahs that are fast, there are some cheetahs that are slow, there are some cheetahs that are more experienced than others, right? So the cheetahs who can't catch a gazelle, what's going to happen to them? They're going to starve, or even if they catch one once in a while, they're not going to have enough energy to actually produce offspring. So they're not going to actually successfully breed, or they're going to produce low quality offspring that are going to die. So they have low fitness. It's only the cheetahs that are very, very exceptionally fast that survive because they catch enough, even fast gazelles, or at least they eat all the slower gazelles, and there's enough for them, but they really can't get the faster gazelles. But those are the cheetahs that get to survive and reproduce. That's coevolution. Reciprocal coevolution, where each side of the interaction, in this case it's an antagonistic interaction where one side is trying to eat the other, or with let's say a disease, there's an organism, an infectious organism like COVID-19, and then there's humans, and the COVID-19 virus actually infects a number of different things, might be of a bat or something else, and humans, and there's reciprocal evolution going on too. Some people's immune systems are stronger and are better able to fight off the COVID-19, and the COVID-19 is selecting for humans with a good immune system, and also it looks like who are younger. older individuals don't survive as well. They have all these lung problems that usually turn into a lethal problem. But there's still the same kind of thing going on with humans and their immune system selecting for the virus in terms of the viral particles that get transmitted. Okay, so one species reciprocally affect each other's phenotypic or genotypic evolution and adaptation in one, alongside a complementary adaptation in another. The gazelle, there's strong selection, directional selection for faster and faster gazelles up to a certain point in terms of physics. And then there's also a concomitant adaptation, faster and faster cheetahs up to a certain point where neither species can go any further. So coevolution like to happen when two different species have close ecological interactions with one another. And there are predator-prey and parasite-host interactions that are negative for one species. In other words, one species preys or survives on the suffering and death of the other one. And then there's also competitive species and interactions that are negative perhaps for both, or more so for one than the other, where, let's say, two species are competing for a similar resource. Okay? And unless one species can switch resources, we'll learn about this later in ecology, the better competitive species is going to drive the other one to extinction unless, of course, like the cheetah and gazelle, it's possible the cheetah and the cheetah could make the gazelle go extinct or vice versa. Okay? Because the cheetah is better, can always get gazelles, it doesn't matter. Okay? And that might happen a lot of times in new interactions. But over long term, usually there's kind of an equilibrium balance. And so the same thing can happen with competition for resources. Okay, and then finally, there are interactions where both species actually benefit from the interaction they're doing, like pollination mutualisms, seed dispersal mutualisms, and a bunch of other kinds. Okay, so antagonistic coevolution, anything between predator-prey relationships, and it's called antagonistic. Antagonism, we sometimes have antagonisms between one person and another. They get into big fights, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so they negatively affect each other's fitness, causing evolutionary change in both species, and it creates kind of an evolutionary arms race, as I mentioned. Okay, antagonistic coevolution. And so here's a predator-prey relationship between a predator, a lion, prey, a zebra. And it's not only also animals, you can also have it between animals and plants, like a mouse is eating the seeds from a plant. Okay, so is there a way for the plant to defend itself against being eaten to extinction? Okay, so that's predator-prey relationships, where they're both, though, exerting strong selection on the other. When it comes to two predator and prey of animals, one is trying to eat the other, and the other one is trying to escape getting eaten. And they both select for traits in the other to overcome that. And usually you get to an equilibrium. Otherwise, one species goes extinct. The same thing with plants and animals animals eating plants or whatever. And then parasites, there's the Red Queen hypothesis. So, the Red Queen. Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, down the rabbit hole, right? And the Red Queen hypothesis is that Alice gets down and the Red Queen is running. And she's running faster and faster, and Alice is trying to catch up. And Alice says, "Why are you running so fast?" basically. And the Red Queen says, "Well, we have to run faster and faster just to get where we're going. And if you slow down, you'll never catch up." So that's the Red Queen hypothesis. So it's kind of like predator-prey coevolution. Each side is trying to escape from the other in terms of parasites. So if you would, there's another video on Canvas I'd like you to watch. It's on cordyceps fungi, and which are fungi that infect a whole bunch of insects, including ants. And this is so there's a combination of the parasite infecting, and the ants have things that they can do to stop the infection. Okay, they have anti-predator defenses. So, like this zebra here also has an anti-predator defense. Or let's say the plant that this mouse is eating the seeds might be toxic. Okay, so that's what's happening. Okay, competition. So the different kinds of competition: interspecific competition. That means interspecific. That means within the same species. And then there's interspecific, between different species. So these are sea stars. They different colors, but they're the same species, and they're competing for space, just like the mussels on this rock in the intertidal zone are competing for space as well. Fortunately, the sea stars are eating the mussels, so they don't let the mussels actually take over everything. Or these wolves are competing against each other for this carcass. Or you might have antagonistic a competition between, let's say, wolves and grizzly bears, or maybe a raven getting in there and trying to steal some food. Or also, you have between these different herbivores that eat leaves, they're competing for leaves. Well, in this case, they've managed to, in a sense, divide up the vegetation. Okay? Now, it turns out, of course, the giraffe can eat anything that this little gazelle could eat as well, right? But the gazelle can't eat what the giraffe is eating. But usually they start, eventually, the species change to they're eating different things. So when that happens, they get something called niche divergence, where they start eating different parts of their diet. So the giraffes eat the leaves only in the certain tall trees, like in the background, or the very tallest here, whereas this gazelle is eating some from some other part of the plant or a different plant. And that's when you get what's called character display. Okay. And then mutualistic coevolution. We've seen this before, but we've got hummingbirds and insects do the same thing. So plants make flowers that are very easily detected. Hummingbirds, of course, have a very good visual sense, but there's other things like moths that don't. They go more on, let's say, fragrance. So they use their smell sense. And in this case, the plant is providing nectar. So the bird comes in to drink the nectar, and in the process, they get covered in pollen. Then they go to another flower. Mind you, the flowers have, in this case, are probably hermaphrodites, so they have both female and male parts. The hummingbird flies to another flower, drinks nectar from that, and pollinates that, and takes pollen from that and goes around. So that's a mutualism where they're both benefiting, kind of a quid pro quo. And in this coevolution, an interesting thing often happens. You start getting characters that that evolve to make the interaction happen easier. So a lot of hummingbirds specifically pollinate flowers that have, let's say, long corolla tubes that only they can actually access. So the plant relies on the hummingbird, this species, because the bill is just right, and the hummingbird relies on the plant. So this is something I saw in a lot in Panama. There's a species of heliconia that have these beautiful big flowers, and they're pollinated by certain species of hummingbirds. Okay. And then the same sort of thing, we get convergence in this, a convergent mutualism. This is actually a bird from the Hawaiian Islands. It doesn't hover, but it's also a nectivore and does the same thing for Hawaiian flowers with long corolla tubes. Same thing with African sunbird and then hummingbird moth. But these are all mutualistic coevolutions. So it's a win-win situation. And then you get the same sort of thing with seed dispersal. A lot of plants, not only do they make flowers, but eventually the flowers, they get pollinated and they turn into fruit, apples and pears and berries and all that. Well, it's expensive to make that. Why would a plant actually make expensive fruit? Well, to attract an animal to come along, to eat the fruit, and then after they've gone away from the plant, they're going to either poop the fruit out or the seeds out, or regurgitate the seeds elsewhere. The plant gets dispersal away from the plant for colonizing new habitats and new areas, and yet the animal gets, of course, a reward again. Instead of nectar, in this case, it's fruit. Okay. Now the thing is, in a lot of mutualisms, like in seed dispersal, they're diffuse mutualisms, where there's a bunch of different species that feed on, let's say in this case, different kinds of fruit. And there's a number of different plants that rely on species of birds to feed on them, but it's asymmetrical. So, for example, this hawthorn, the main bird that actually eats it, so dependence on the plant, most of the seeds that are dispersed successfully are by the redwing. Okay? On the other way around, though, the redwing actually doesn't eat, the dependence on the frugivore for the plant, like the redwing eats a lot of different things. And so it eats some of this, some of that, some of that. This blackcap, of course, it relies a lot on this barberry, okay? But the barberry actually relies much more on the robin, European robin instead, okay? So all of these things are part of a mutualism, but it's not a one-to-one mutualism. It's many species of birds, and